Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at this fascinating open letter.
Oh, yeah.
Written by an Eritrean citizen, Tedros Fessahaye, to the Ethiopian parliament.
Wow.
Back in 2018. And it's a really interesting time. It's during this, very pivotal moment in the peace process between Eritrea and Ethiopia.
Right.
And as we know, peace processes are always complex.
Absolutely.
But this one is just layers upon layers of history and emotion and politics.
For sure.
And Fessahaye really lived through it all.
He did.
And his letter gives us this just incredibly personal window into what was at stake for Eritreans.
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the official statements and things like that. But this letter just brings us right down to the human level.
Yeah.
It helps us grasp the fears, the hopes, the anxieties that were swirling around at the time.
Absolutely. So let's just get some context here first. We know Eritrea and Ethiopia have a long history of conflict, but how long are we talking here?
We're talking nearly 60 years of conflict.
Wow.
Punctuated by these brief, fragile periods of peace.
Ah.
Just think about that, almost an entire lifetime.
Right.
Marked by the threat of war.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Fessahaye describes, growing up with this constant feeling of being under siege.
Wow. So he's not just writing this from some, intellectual standpoint. He's pouring his lived experience into this.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so powerful.
Yeah.
He talks about the Badme War from 1998 to 2000, which for many Eritreans was this deeply traumatic event.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about the territory itself. It was about what that territory represented.
So help me understand that a little bit more.
Okay.
Why was the Badme War so significant in shaping the Eritrean perspective on this peace process?
Well, you have to remember that Eritrea had finally gained its independence from Ethiopia in 1993 after this decades-long struggle.
Yeah.
For many Eritreans, Badme became a symbol of that hard-won independence.
Right.
It was like losing a part of themselves.
Oh.
A part of their national identity.
Yeah, it's so interesting how these physical places can take on such powerful symbolic meaning, especially in these contexts of conflict.
Yeah, and that's why I think understanding Eritrean identity is key to unlocking their perspective on the peace process.
Okay.
Fessahaye describes this feeling that many Eritreans had.
Right.
They were willing to pay any price to defend their land.
Wow.
And their independence.
Yeah.
He even quotes Eritrea's longtime leader, Isaias Afwerki, who said that if Ethiopia occupied their land again, it is tantamount that the sun will never rise again.
Wow, that's some pretty serious imagery there.
Yeah.
It really underscores how high the stakes fell.
It does.
For Eritreans, they'd already fought so hard for their independence. Can you imagine that feeling? Like your very existence as a nation being threatened.
And that feeling was fueled by the narrative that was circulating within Eritrea at the time.
What kind of narrative are we talking about?
Well, according to Fessahaye, Eritreans were told that Ethiopia started the war as a way to undermine their independence and grab their territory.
Wow.
Whether or not that was entirely accurate, it created this just pervasive fear of being wiped off the map.
It's like that primal instinct to protect what's yours,
but
to take into like a national level.
Exactly.
No wonder there was so much distrust and animosity.
It's essential to understand how those wartime narratives shape public perception.
Yeah.
They become so deeply ingrained. And they make it incredibly difficult to build trust. Even when there's a genuine desire for peace.
And that leads us to this period that Fessahaye calls
no war, no peace.
No war, no peace.
You're going to have to explain that one to me.
Okay.
What exactly does that mean? And what impact did it have on Eritrea?
So imagine this, the war officially ends. But there's no real peace agreement. No resolution, no sense of security.
Oh, gosh.
That's what Eritrea faced.
Wow.
For 2 whole decades.
Oh, my God.
After the Badme War.
That's a long time.
It is. It's like a wound that never heals properly.
Oh, gosh.
It keeps getting re-injured and the pain just lingers.
That sounds utterly exhausting.
It is.
Just this constant state of tension and uncertainty.
And it had a devastating impact on Eritrea. Imagine trying to rebuild your economy, your society, your entire future with this dark cloud of potential conflict hanging over you.
Yeah, no wonder there was so much skepticism when the peace process finally started.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these historical layers fed into the Eritrean perspective.
Yeah. But I imagine the peace process itself also threw up some curveballs, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fessahaye talks about how confusing and unsettling it was to hear public statements from both Eritrean and Ethiopian leaders during this time.
Yeah.
There were these mixed messages that left people feeling like they were being kept in the dark.
Can you give me an example?
Sure.
What kind of statements were raising eyebrows?
Well, on the Eritrean side, Isaias Afwerki, who had been in power for decades, made a statement that really threw people off.
Okay.
He basically said that the idea of Eritreans and Ethiopians being different people was a fallacy, that anyone who believed that does not know the truth.
So almost downplaying the distinction between the two nations. Yeah. What was the reaction to that?
It was met with a lot of confusion, especially considering the decades of conflict and the hard-fought battle for Eritrean independence.
Yes.
People were struggling to understand what he meant and what his intentions were.
So a lot of suspicion and trying to read between the lines.
Totally.
And what about on the Ethiopian side?
Okay.
Was their messaging any clearer?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
At the time, Abiy Ahmed was the new prime minister of Ethiopia, and he was the one who initiated the peace process.
Okay.
He made some statements that seemed to directly contradict Afwerki's stance.
What did he say?
He said that the two countries had never talked about the border and that borders are meaningless.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah.
How do you go from fighting a war over a border to saying borders don't matter?
Exactly. It's a big disconnect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like a pretty big disconnect.
It does. And it left a lot of people on both sides feeling bewildered and anxious. They're trying to figure out if these were genuine attempts at reconciliation.
Right.
You know, clever political maneuvering.
Yeah.
Or perhaps a combination of both.
So it wasn't just the weight of history.
Yeah.
It was also the uncertainty of the present that was feeding into the anxieties of the Eritrean people.
And that's what makes this letter so valuable.
Yeah.
It captures that feeling of being caught between the past and the future.
Right.
Not quite sure which way to turn.
And all of this makes understanding the Eritrean perspective on issues like the Red Sea and border demarcation even more crucial, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Yeah. These aren't just these abstract political issues.
Right.
They're deeply intertwined with Eritrean identity, security, and their vision for the future.
It sounds like we're about to dive into some pretty deep waters here. This is where it gets really fascinating.
It is. Because to understand the Eritrean stance on these issues, we need to understand their history.
Okay.
Their geography and the relationship with the sea that has shaped so much of their existence.
Okay.
So
let's dive in.
Let's do it. For a country like Eritrea that sits right on the Red Sea, access to that sea isn't just about geography.
Right.
It's about survival.
It's a lifeline, not just a coastline.
Exactly. For centuries, the Red Sea has been this vital artery for trade, cultural exchange, and yes, unfortunately also for conflict.
Right.
Control over the Red Sea has meant access to resources, strategic influence, economic opportunities, you name it.
So for a newly independent nation like Eritrea, securing its access to the Red Sea isn't just a matter of drawing lines on a map.
No.
It's about securing its future.
Precisely. It's about asserting its place in the world and ensuring its economic and political viability as an independent state.
Yeah.
And that's where the border issue becomes so incredibly sensitive.
Because a clearly defined border is a tangible way of saying, this is ours. This is what we fought for.
Exactly. It becomes this powerful symbol of sovereignty and a way of protecting what they see as rightfully theirs. Remember, Eritrea had to fight tooth and nail for its independence.
Yeah.
Having clear borders is a way of ensuring that their sacrifices weren't in vain.
It's interesting, though, how Fessahaye frames his argument.
Yeah.
He's not saying build a wall and keep everyone out.
Right.
He's actually advocating for a clearly demarcated border as a foundation for cooperation.
That's the really fascinating part.
Okay.
He envisions a future where once the border issue is settled, Eritrea and Ethiopia can move forward as partners.
Wow.
He talks about open borders, economic cooperation, mutually beneficial agreements. It's almost as if he's saying, let's get this one sensitive issue out of the way, and then we can truly be good neighbors.
So in his mind, resolving the border dispute is a prerequisite for any kind of meaningful peace.
It is.
It's not just about ending the fighting. It's about creating the conditions for a healthy, sustainable relationship.
Exactly. And this is where his background as someone who's lived through decades of conflict really comes into play. He understands the anxieties and sensitivities surrounding this border issue. And he believes that addressing it head on is the only way to move past that legacy of mistrust.
So he's not just speaking from some theoretical standpoint.
No.
He's speaking from the heart.
He is.
From a place of deeply personal experience.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial layer in his letter. His concerns about the internal political situation in Eritrea. He acknowledges that Eritrea doesn't have a functioning parliament. Or legal institutions that truly represent the diversity of its people.
And he sees this as a major obstacle.
He does.
To achieving a genuine and lasting peace.
Absolutely. He's worried that any peace agreement reached with the current Eritrean regime might not have the full backing of the Eritrean people. And he's not shy about expressing his criticisms.
Yeah, you're right. He's pretty blunt.
He is.
In his assessment of the situation. He even draws a direct connection between the peace agreement signed in Algeria in 2000 and the subsequent wave of arrests and detentions in Eritrea.
Yes. He claims that many Eritreans, including high-ranking officials and journalists, were accused of collaborating with Ethiopia and imprisoned.
It's a chilling reminder that these peace agreements are often fragile things, especially when one of the parties involved has a history of silencing dissent and cracking down on any perceived threats to its power.
And it raises some really tough questions.
It does.
For those involved in mediating or facilitating such peace processes, how do you ensure that the pursuit of peace doesn't inadvertently legitimize or empower authoritarian regimes? It's a delicate balancing act.
It is. And Fessahaye doesn't seem to have all the answers. He's essentially raising a red flag saying, hey, Ethiopian parliament, be careful here. You're dealing with a regime that has a track record of human rights abuses.
Exactly. He's urging them to be mindful of this reality when negotiating agreements. Recognizing that any deal struck with the current Eritrean regime might not have the full backing of the Eritrean people. He even warns that any agreement might be rejected by Eritrean opposition groups, which could further destabilize the situation.
So he's pushing the Ethiopian parliament to be more than just negotiators.
More than that.
He's asking them to be advocates for a peace that's inclusive and representative of all Eritreans, not just those in power.
He wants them to leverage their own democratic gains to push for greater inclusivity in the peace process to make sure that the voices of ordinary Eritreans are heard.
It's a tall order, especially when you're dealing with a regime that's notoriously closed off and resistant to outside pressure.
And that's why Fessahaye's letter is so important. It's not just a plea for peace. It's a call for a peace that's built on justice, accountability, and the genuine participation of the people.
It's a reminder that these peace processes are rarely simple or straightforward. They often involve navigating these complex internal dynamics and balancing competing interests.
And it highlights the importance of engaging with all stakeholders, not just those in power, to ensure that peace agreements are inclusive, durable, and truly serve the interest of the people they are meant to benefit.
It's not just about ending the violence. You need to address the root causes of the conflict, including poverty, inequality, lack of access to basic rights and freedoms.
It's about creating the conditions for a just and equitable society where people feel like they have a stake in the future and where they trust their government to represent their interests.
And that's precisely where Fessahaye's letter leads us next.
It does.
Having laid out all of his concerns.
Yes.
He offers some concrete recommendations.
He does.
To the Ethiopian parliament. So given everything he said about the history, the context, the internal situation in Eritrea, what does he actually propose they do?
Well, he lays out 4 key points.
Okay.
And they're all rooted in this idea of a win-win outcome for both Eritrea and Ethiopia.
Right.
He's not talking about one side getting everything they want at the expense of the other.
Okay.
He's talking about finding solutions that benefit both nations.
That sounds ideal, but is it really achievable?
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
Especially in a context where there's been so much mistrust and animosity.
Yeah.
But Fessahaye believes it is possible.
Okay.
And his recommendations are designed to create a pathway towards that kind of mutually beneficial peace.
Okay. I'm definitely intrigued. Let's dive into those recommendations.
All right.
What's the first thing he suggests?
He starts by emphasizing the need to prioritize border demarcation.
Okay.
As the foundational step toward lasting peace.
Oh, okay.
Remember we talked about how sensitive this issue is for Eritreans? How it ties into their sense of identity and security?
Right.
He sees resolving this as absolutely essential.
Makes sense. If you can't agree on where the borders are, it's hard to move forward on anything else.
Yeah. It's like trying to build a house without a foundation.
That's a great analogy.
And he's very clear about what he means by demarcation.
Okay.
He's not talking about building walls or fences.
Right.
He simply wants a clearly defined and internationally recognized border between these 2 sovereign nations.
So clear lines on a map agreed upon by both sides.
Yes.
And recognized by the international community.
Exactly.
That seems pretty reasonable.
Yeah, it does. He sees it as a fundamental element of national sovereignty.
Okay.
And a necessary precondition for establishing trust and stability.
And he even addresses those potential concerns.
He does.
That some might have about a clearly demarcated border.
Yeah.
Emphasizing that it doesn't preclude cooperation or free movement of people and goods between the 2 countries.
He envisions a future where once the border issue is settled,
Eritrea
and Ethiopia can enjoy a relationship characterized by open borders, economic cooperation, mutually beneficial agreements.
So the border, in his view, is not a barrier, but a starting point.
Exactly. And that leads us to his second recommendation, which builds directly on this idea of mutual benefit. He insists that all agreements must be based on a win-win principle, ensuring that both nations benefit from the peace process.
That sounds idealistic. How do you actually achieve that in practice?
That's a great question.
Yeah, what does a win-win outcome actually look like?
Well, it requires a shift in mindset. A willingness to move beyond the zero-sum game. Where one side's gain is automatically the other side's loss. It means finding creative solutions that address the core needs and concerns of both parties, even if it means compromising on certain demands.
So it's about expanding the pie, not just fighting over the slices.
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that cooperation can lead to greater prosperity and security for both nations, whereas conflict only leads to more suffering and instability.
And this brings us back to the internal political situation in Eritrea. Which Fessahaye has been so critical of. How does he address that in his recommendations?
That's where his third point comes in. He urges the Ethiopian parliament to recognize the lack of a legitimate representative parliament in Eritrea and to adjust agreements accordingly. He's basically saying, don't assume that any agreement reached with the current Eritrean regime will automatically reflect the will of the Eritrean people.
That's a tricky one.
It is.
How do you negotiate a binding agreement when one side doesn't have a truly representative government?
It's a tough question. And there's no easy answer. It requires a nuanced understanding of the internal dynamics of both countries and a willingness to find creative solutions.
He's basically urging them to think outside the box.
He is.
To find ways to ensure that the Eritrean people are genuinely represented in the process. So it's not just about striking a deal. It's about striking a deal that's fair. Legitimate, and has a chance of actually lasting.
Exactly. And this leads us to his final and perhaps most crucial recommendation.
I'm all ears. What's the fourth point on his list?
He calls for the involvement of the Eritrean people in the peace process. He argues that genuine and sustainable peace can only be achieved when the people who have a stake in the outcome are included and their voices are heard.
It all comes back to the idea that peace can't be imposed from the top down. It has to grow from the ground up.
That's a great way to summarize it. And it's a sentiment that resonates deeply with many people who've experienced the devastation of conflict.
Right.
They yearn for a peace that's not just about the absence of war, but about the presence of justice, fairness, and a genuine sense of hope for the future.
It sounds like Fessahaye is really challenging the Ethiopian parliament.
He is.
To step up and be more than just negotiators.
Right.
He's asking them to be champions for a peace that's truly inclusive and representative of the Eritrean people.
He's pushing them to think beyond the immediate political calculations and to embrace a more principled approach to peace building, one that prioritizes the long-term well-being of both nations.
And you know what strikes me is how relevant his recommendations still feel today, even though they were written back in 2018.
The situation in both Eritrea and Ethiopia has evolved since then.
Of course.
But many of the underlying challenges remain.
The need for a clearly defined border, the desire for those mutually beneficial agreements, the importance of inclusivity and representation. These are all enduring themes.
They are.
That resonate far beyond the specific context of Eritrea and Ethiopia.
And they highlight the fact that peace building is a long and complex process.
It is.
One that requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to engage with difficult questions.
And I think that's a perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll step back from the specifics of Eritrea and Ethiopia and explore some of the broader implications of Fessahaye's letter for peace building around the world.
Because what's fascinating about this letter is how it speaks to these universal themes, these human desires for security, dignity, and a future free from violence.
Exactly. So stay tuned, because we're about to go even deeper. Okay, we're back for this final part of our deep dive into Tedros Fessahaye's letter to the Ethiopian parliament.
Right.
And, you know, we've really dug into the specifics of the Eritrean perspective. But I think there's a lot we can learn from this letter.
I agree.
That applies to peace-building efforts everywhere.
Absolutely.
What do you say?
Fessahaye's letter, while it's deeply rooted in the context of Eritrea and Ethiopia, it touches on these universal truths about peace.
Okay.
It's not just about the absence of war.
Right.
It's about creating a society where everyone feels a sense of belonging.
Okay.
Where their rights are respected and where they have a voice in shaping their own destiny.
It's about building a future where people aren't constantly living in fear.
Yes.
You know, where they can focus on building their lives and their communities. And I think that's what really struck me about his emphasis on this win-win outcome. It's this idea that true peace can only be achieved when everyone feels like they've gained something, even if it means compromise.
That's the ideal. But in the real world, peace negotiations often feel more like a tug of war, with each side vying for the upper hand.
Exactly. So how do we shift that dynamic?
Right. How do we move from this zero-sum mentality to one where cooperation and mutual benefit are seen as the path to lasting peace?
Well, I think Fessahaye's letter offers some clues, don't you think? He talks about the importance of clear communication, of addressing these historical grievances head on, of ensuring that all parties feel heard and represented.
Yeah, he's not just talking about signing a piece of paper. He's talking about building trust.
Which is a much more complex process.
Much more complex. And it requires a willingness to move beyond these simplistic narratives of good guys and bad guys.
Yeah. In any conflict, there are multiple perspectives.
There are.
Multiple truths.
Yeah. And it's only by acknowledging those complexities that you can begin to build the foundation for genuine understanding.
And that's where his point about involving the Eritrean people really hits home for me. It's a reminder that peace can't be imposed from the top down.
No, it has to come from the ground up.
It has to be owned by the people who are most affected by the conflict.
Exactly. And that means creating spaces for dialogue, for healing, for reconciliation. It means investing in these grassroots peace-building initiatives that empower local communities to address their own conflicts and build a culture of peace.
You know, when you put it that way, it makes you realize that peace building is this continuous process, not just a one-time event.
Not at all. It's about changing hearts and minds, shifting attitudes, and building relationships.
Building those relationships.
That's about creating a society where peace becomes the norm.
Right.
Not just the exception.
And that's a vision that I think we can all get behind.
We can.
Right? Regardless of where we live.
Right.
What our background is.
Yeah.
What conflicts we've experienced. I think we all share that fundamental desire
I think so.
for a world where peace prevails.
Absolutely. And I think that's the enduring legacy of Fessahaye's letter.
What is it?
It's this reminder that peace is possible.
Okay.
But it requires courage, commitment, and a willingness to engage in this messy, complex, often frustrating work of building a better future.
It does. And that work starts with understanding.
It does.
With empathy.
Yeah.
With a willingness to listen to those who see the world differently than we do.
Yes. It starts with recognizing our shared humanity and our common desire for a world free from violence and fear.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought, some new insights, and perhaps even inspired you to get involved in peace-building efforts in your own community.
In your own community.
So keep diving deep, keep asking questions.
Keep learning.
And keep striving to make the world a better place.
Yes.
One conversation at a time.
One conversation at a time.
Till next time.